My talk with a few quotes from Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote aphorisms, so he wrote a lot of little things that are what we would today in the comic business call one-liners. First I'm going to quote a Nietzsche scholar who is a little pedantic, but he says, Nietzsche's books are easier to read but harder to understand than those of almost any thinker. And now I will give you a few quotations from Nietzsche, so you can place them. Some of you know Nietzsche quite well, and for some of you he's a new person, but you may recognize some of these quotes. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. It is not lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes an unhappy marriage. We should consider everyday laws on which we have not danced at least once. Professor Gavin is a dancing philosopher. I want to just mention, give him a little credit here. All things are subject to interpretation. Whatever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. All truly great thoughts are conceived by walking. Nietzsche was himself a great hiker. He liked to hike in the mountains. When he was a young man, he hiked in the valleys near river and water. The older he got, the higher he went. Let's see. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. A good rider possesses not only his own spirit, but also the spirit of his friends, which means we should feel free to converse and to use the ideas of our friends together. There's plenty of room back there. Thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, and simpler. We have art in order not to die of the truth. And the last and perhaps most dangerous one for me today, is life not 1,000 times too short for us to bore ourselves? So I better not bore you, or you might have to decide to leave. So today I want to talk about two things. I was going to talk about one thing, the place of Eros in Nietzsche's writings about sexuality and gender. But this is a talk in a series, the series aimed at philosophy students, people interested in philosophy, potential philosophy students, and so far there's been a discussion of comparative religion and a discussion by the President and Chancellor entitled The Future of Our Higher Education Institutions, Philosophical Perspectives. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Nietzsche as educator as well. But first, Nietzsche is known in the common world in two ways. As the kind of bad Nietzsche. The bad Nietzsche is someone who was perhaps a Nazi. That'd be pretty bad, right? Someone who was a nihilist, meaning he believed in nothing. Someone who was an anti-rationalist, which I might think of as a good thing, maybe. Someone who announced the death of God if he didn't actually bring it about. And along with the charge of Nazism is sometimes a charge of anti-Semitism and German nationalism, which is associated with that. Now, Nietzsche is really not guilty of many of those things, especially the association with the Nazis. He became ill as a fairly young man in his 40s, and his sister, who was married to an anti-Semite and a nationalist, you know, if you can think of someone as a professional anti-Semite, it seems peculiar to identify in this way, but that was indeed the case. And she had control of his estate for the last 11 years of his life. So she actually invited Hitler to go to the Nazi archive. There's a picture of Hitler at the front door being greeted by Frau Elisabeth Foster Nietzsche. But of course Nietzsche is long gone by then. So she controlled his reputation for a long time and destroyed some things and tried to gain power herself by possessing that archive. Other things we might say about Nietzsche. He's a misogynist, a racist, a white supremacist maybe. He has an idea of the Übermenschen and really has to be interrogated before we think about who he is. Some people don't like the fact that he considered himself, as he put it, the last anti-political German. Most Germans were obsessed with politics and involved with them. But he's equally opposed to democracy, commodity capitalism, socialism, anarchism. And to quote a small passage from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "The state is the coldest of all monsters. Coldly it lies too. And this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people." So he's very critical of people who are represented by something other than who they are. He is elitist about education and continues the idea of the German idea of the genius. And sometimes he's quite juvenile about this, especially in his early writing. And he spawned, I hope I don't get too many people in me, a lot of cults of idiots who thought they were better than everyone else, and Ayn Rand springs to mind here. Sorry about that for if you love Ayn Rand. And then there's also the good Nietzsche that we hear about in popular culture, the philosopher of joy. The task of becoming what you are. It's the task for which we must learn to love ourselves and learn to love the world as we find it. And that love includes the full ranges of yes and no, of joy and suffering. So Nietzsche talks a great deal about how we have, in a way, a job as a philosopher to accept the life that we are living, but to engage in an aesthetic and a creative process of transforming that life into something worth living. And it's a job for us to do. Now, very early on, a number of people immediately took up what Nietzsche was talking about, and they range very widely. Isadora Duncan, a dancer, always traveled with a copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra with her. So she started a new kind of dancing, which was dancing from the inside, from the spirit, not just doing ballet moves that were prearranged. And Rockwell Kent, who we know as someone who worked in Maine, read Thus Spake Zarathustra on his journey to Alaska and did a number of drawings of Zarathustra and Zarathustra's animals. So the good Nietzsche is the Nietzsche who wants a philosopher who can dance. Philosophy which is nimble and not pedantic. He's a philosopher of embodiment, attending to the drives and impulses, trusting the meaning for a human of the whole of our nature, of all of our wills. He's opposed to nationalism. He's opposed to anti-Semitism, opposed to Socrates, Plato, Kant, critical of positivism, utilitarianism. Okay, take a deep breath. Nietzsche would have hated analytic philosophy, except perhaps the good and deep rhetorical analyses of ordinary language. He was courageous and above all posthumous. By posthumous thinker, a posthumous thinker is one whose time comes after his death. Nietzsche was always writing for a new generation, for one to come, one which would throw out the yoke of oppressive institutions, state, religious, and educational. As I said, the future of higher education, the talk that we had a little while ago, inspired me to think a little bit about Nietzsche's views of education. Nietzsche was an elitist about education. I never gloss over or make nice what philosophers are, right? We think about what we can do with them. No, there's no question about it. He was a snob, okay? And he thought that the university was, especially as a young man, was not for everyone. Not for the masses, the hoi polloi, the herd. In his early book, The Future of Our Educational Institution, he condemned people to their social class as if there were a kind of natural aristocracy. Right. Nietzsche's own education was a very privileged education, a very fine education, even though he was not wealthy. He comes from a line of Lutheran ministers. Since he was initially going to be trained as a Lutheran minister, he was given access to really very great schools, very good schools. He comes from a narrow and potentially pedantic field, philology, or as it's now called, classics, the study of Greek and Roman cultures. And he makes up this intense study of ancient, and dare we say dead languages, right, Greek and Latin, history and art and literature. He makes up that study of things that we think of as in no way practical or helpful to us. A way to open up Europe to a new way of thinking about itself. He calls himself a cultural critic. We'll return to that in a little while. I would say that our own classics department does that as well. It really tries to use the study of the ancient world in order to invigorate today, and I hope that our philosophy department does it as well. So he was trained in the humanities, in the narrowest sense, historical antiquity, in a relatively short time. His training is intense in the period of Greek and Roman antiquity. And in the broadest sense, every intersecting discipline. So he's looking not just at, he's not only reading philosophy, he's reading art, he's reading histories, he's reading plays, he's reading philosophy. And because it made of Nietzsche what many of us hope for at USM and any university, it made of him a lifelong learner. He applied the deep thinking and discipline he got as a scholar to the problem of his age and spent his entire life thinking and writing. Okay? So the kind of education he got wasn't necessarily a preparation for employment. It was a preparation for life. But he talks rather critically about what's happening in Germany at the time as Germany begins to start to prepare people for employment instead of prepare people for life. And he's concerned that it will produce these people he calls current men, right? That he's concerned that if education becomes democratic, what will happen is they will not be able to teach as difficult courses. They will not have the teachers to teach these people, these large amounts of people as well. And so what will happen is it will be watered down. And as soon as it's watered down, it will be in service to the state and it will be in service to commerce, right? And so you start to attract people to education who think that the highest good that they can get from education is to make money and more money and more money. Okay? So, he says, the purpose of this education, according to this scheme, would be to rear the most current men possible. Current being used here in the sense in which it is applied to the coins of the realm. The greater the number of such men, the happier the nation will be. This precisely is the purpose of our modern educational institutions. So he's very concerned with the idea that people, if there is a broad education, people will be allowed only the precise amount of culture which is compatible with the interest of monetary gain. Okay? So that you would, in effect, begin to think of your education in terms of what it can do for you in that sense. The philosopher, it might seem, in these masses, to these masses, that education for the greatest number of men was only a means to the earthly bliss of a few. The greatest possible expansion of education so enfeebles education that it can no longer confer privileges or inspire respect. That might be true in the U.S. I'm not sure. That is to say, as education has become so widely available, it's not respected as a profession. When I travel to Africa, people speak to me with such respect. They say, "You're a teacher? You have a PhD?" It's actually, I fall down in a dead faint when I first started having it. They say, because if I say I'm a teacher, I'm a professor here, it's like, get a job, make some money. If you went to school that long, shouldn't you at least be a lawyer or a doctor, right? So he's saying he's worried in a way, and I'm saying he's an elitist. He's worried in a way that, for one thing, that the scholarship will get watered down, that the people who become in control of education will be people who want workers, right? And who want to change the character of people of thought to people who are willing to do what they need to do to make that cash. Okay. I think I'm going to skip ahead and just go to the other part of it. But I do want to say that he invokes the German philosopher poet Goethe in his own idea of what would be good education. And he says, Goethe, and he said, and to a certain extent, we found this in ancient Greece, Goethe says, I don't want to learn anything that is not going to in some way enliven and enrich my life, right? That is what knowledge is about, right? Knowledge is to make my world broader, to make what happens in my life richer. And so there are two competing views of education that are rising in Germany in the 19th century. One is coming out of positivism and is influenced by British style and German style utilitarianism, which says, okay, we're going to have an education for the end. The end will be to create good workers or good people who fit into the system. And the other system is called the magisterial tradition. This magisterial tradition is saying that we want people to learn in order to transform themselves, to learn, to be inspired by what they read, and not necessarily to go in any particular toward any particular end, right? We want them to to become creative in a way, to become leaders of the world. And I guess I was inspired to say this, I might as well just ruin my career entirely, because I see the tendency in our culture now to be that this education, this elite education that Nietzsche is talking about, will continue to be available to elite people, right? To people who have sufficient wealth or sufficient ambition to get it. But what is happening now is other people are being encouraged to think of themselves as people who need training for a job. Most people don't need training for a job. Most jobs will train you once you get the job, right? But so I'm very critical of the idea that institutions like USM are being turned into factories producing workers. And one of the things that is extremely discouraging to me too, because at the other moment this happened in the 1980s, the other thing that happened was students began to see each other as competitors for jobs, not as allies in the practice of getting an education. Not working together to make social change, but as competitors for the scarce resource of employment. Now, what does our president call these, rants? Done with a rant. Okay, I'll get a little more to this college. Okay. Nietzsche's reputation is built upon his role as cultural physician. He considered European culture sick and set for himself an enormous task of moral and cultural reform. The reevaluation of all values aims at the specific problems of the culture of his age. So, unlike some philosophers, he's not so much interested in giving us a grand theory. He is interested in transforming the culture that he finds in not just Germany, but Europe. In order to gauge the health of contemporary European culture, he engages in comparisons with ancient and contemporary cultures. Philosophy is for him a process of reclamation and invention. We reclaim the healthy philosophies of the past, and we reinvent a new philosophy of culture for the future. A culture's view of sexuality becomes a barometer for its health. The illness of culture rests in its suppression of instinct. A healthy culture requires the reintegration of drives and impulses. Nietzsche's views of sex can be gleaned from 4 strands in his thought: his general remarks on passion, the types of philosophers who are its enemies, his powerful and prevalent sexual metaphors, which we find in reading him, his remarks on reproduction, and his employment of dynamic impulses using masculine and female imagery. As is the case with his remarks about art, reference to sex and sexuality and passion are scattered throughout his works. There's not just one book that we read that we're going to get, this is the story. It's not like Foucault, where he wrote a history of sexuality to say, okay, I'll read that book. Nor have there been many articles on his views of sexuality, in spite of a veritable cottage industry on his views about women. His views of gender range from the merely conventional to the enigmatic, and in them is to be found much of his writing on sexuality. The most philosophically profound remarks about sexuality occur in Nietzsche's attempt to counter various fleshless philosophies of the past, especially those that suppress the passions. These range from his critiques of Euripides and Socrates, who are accused of removing passion from art and thought, to critique of these same tendencies in his contemporary, especially in positivist and utilitarian. The bloodless tenor of the works, their admitted escape from the transitoriness of feeling, and the very smallness of their goals are what damn them in Nietzsche's eyes. For Nietzsche, these signaled a philosophy motivated by fear of the unknown, but more important to our inquiry, fear of the passions. Impulses natural to and important for the full experience of life. So what Nietzsche is saying is philosophy, surprise, surprise, is a very rational field, right? It tries to understand the world in terms of logic, in terms of fairly regimented thinking. Scientific thinking works in that way as well often. And Nietzsche feels like for too long, this kind of thinking has inhibited European thought. And it's been policed by religions which accept a divorce between body and soul, a divorce between the impulse, the desire, the embodied person, and especially the idea of an immortal soul. Okay? So Nietzsche thinks that the Platonic view of the radical difference between the forms of the soul and the body living and working through this world has just been entrenched in popular culture, not only in high culture, not only in philosophy. So he thinks that the job of the cultural physician is to do away with that divorce, the divorce between the embodied, icky, mortal person, right, and the disembodied, immaterial soul, which we come to understand through reason and reason alone. Okay? So Nietzsche wants to unite those together. He does this in a way that some of us may find it's very easy to be critical about, because a lot of times he looks at these theoretical writers and he says, what kind of person would write something like that? And he looks at Kant, he looks at Heraclitus, he says, we should ask that question all the time. Now, in some kinds of formal philosophy, that's considered an ad hominem approach, right? We're looking at the man, the person, not at the person's ideas. But for Nietzsche, because he's talking about transforming culture and he thinks we have to transform the person, it's really important for him to think about what kind of person would write such a thing. So, in this sense, his entire philosophy from start to finish is an indictment of those who fear the erotic. The resurrection of the erotic motivates his interest in the underside of cultures of Greek antiquity. The birth of tragedy moves the high point of antiquity back prior to the Golden Age. When we think of the Golden Age, what we think of the great age of philosophy, the great age of Euripides, that playwright, of Socrates, and more importantly for us, I think Plato. And we think of statuary that gives us an ideal view, and architecture likewise. Okay, what the birth of tragedy does, it counters this trend to whitewash Greek culture and make it palatable to a Christian or positivistic age. Nietzsche turns back to the Greeks for a legacy which includes the sensual and the sexual. It is here I set the Dionysus of the Greeks, the religious affirmation of life, life whole and not denied in part. Typical, that sexual act arouses profundity, mystery, and reverence. Right? So when he was studying ancient Greece, he wasn't getting watered down versions of it. He was reading the real text in the original languages, and he chose to see what other people, he and his friend, to his credit, Erwin Rhoda, another scholar, both said, look at these crazy ecstatic religions that were going at the same time. We're talking about this great golden age. Why are we not looking at those? That's part of antiquity. And they chose not only to see those things, but especially for Nietzsche to value those things. So part of what made Greece great was not just democracy, or however limited that democracy was. It was not just this great moment in art. What the diversity within the culture and the coming together of both an impulse toward reason, knowledge, and philosophy, and an impulse to understand this other side of human beings, this desire. Okay, and he says the fact that early Greek art, and especially plays, struggled with this, is what made that a great moment. Because afterwards, they just suppressed that Dionysian. They suppressed that desire. They suppressed the idea that part of us could be that irrational. But in doing that, so much power, so much energy is lost. The resurrection of the erotic motivates his interest in the undersides of cultures of Greek antiquity. Let me see, I don't want to. This is what happens when you go off text. Nietzsche sees Christianity as a natural heir to the Socratic and Platonic project is quite clear. The other world created by Christianity is based on the rejection of the realities of this world, the physicality of the world. The Christian priest is from the first a mortal enemy of sensuality, he says. No greater antithesis can be imagined than the innocent, awed, and solemn attitude by which the most honorable women's cults of Athens, in presence of the symbol of sex, the act of procreation is the mystery, as such, in all non-ascetic religions, a sort of symbol of perfection and of the mysterious design of the future, rebirth and immortality. In the early Greek views, the presence of the phallus, to which Nietzsche alludes in this quotation, is a natural part of spiritual life. It was Christianity, on the basis of its resentment against life, that first made something unclean out of sexuality. In most of his writings on antiquity, Nietzsche is concentrating on a masculine, a phallic view of sexuality. The church fights passion by cutting it out. He's not just referring to Catholicism, Lutheranism too. The church fights passion by cutting it out in every sense. Its practice, its therapy is castration. As we see in these passages, Nietzsche's most passionate and forceful writing uses strong sensual and sexual imagery. It has as its end the serious criticism of the sterility of many philosophies. To extend his criticism further into history, positivism retains the Puritanism of Christianity on matters sexual. It has yet to be seriously reevaluated. So he believes that actually when we get rid of this kind of puritanical view of religion, still our science, in our science, is going to be hidden these presumptions as well. Nietzsche takes philosophy's new job to be cultural creation. As the early Greek thinkers have said, and Nietzsche reiterated, a lot of life is ugly and frightening. Rather than veil it, like Schopenhauer suggests, Nietzsche says we should transfigure it. Sexual physiology will then require a transfiguration. A human being under the skin is for all lovers a horror, unthinkable, a blasphemy against God and love. So what the masculine artist does because of the point here is to just think about the naked sexual act. It's not awe-inspiring. Maybe it is on certain kinds of media, not the media Nietzsche's talking about. So the masculine artist is transform what he finds. Nietzsche imagines this transformation in love too. Like Schopenhauer, for whom the actual physical reality of the female form and function inspires revulsion. Schopenhauer has this essay on women in which we're like, ugh, like who would care for these little short, ugly kind of beings? Nietzsche laments the very reality of women's embodied nature. Consider the following passage. He says, when we love a woman, we easily conceive a hatred for nature on account of all the repulsive natural function to which every woman is subject. We prefer not to think of this at all. Why? Then we refuse to pay any heed to physiology and decree secretly, I want to hear nothing about the fact that a human being is something more than soul and form. So he's saying these very ideas of love preclude looking at a human being as entirely embodied, and especially as a female subject is entirely embodied. Am I going to, how long? We have any timekeepers? Well, I'll go on a little bit, and we can't take any more, just scream, you don't have to. Nietzsche's physiological explanation of women's purpose tend to sound essentialist. Women are seen as breeders, as helpmates to men, the recreation of the warrior. And everything in woman is a riddle. Everything in woman hath one solution, and it is called pregnancy, from Zarathustra. Right? Oh, discouraging, huh? So, and then what happens when she's a mother, right? In the Gay Science, he says, the females find in their children satisfaction for their desire to dominate, right? So, mothers dominating their kids. A possession, their child is a possession, an occupation, something that is wholly intelligible to them and can be chattered with, because that's what women do, is they chatter, right? Pregnancy has made women kinder, more patient, more timid, more pleased to submit. This physiology condemns women to a destiny of submission. Yet pregnancy and giving birth become the noblest of virtues, the most potent metaphors for masculine creativity. He constantly used these birthing metaphors, which are physiological in the case of women, as these immensely robust metaphors in the case of writing about men. Because men give birth to thought. Women merely give birth to biological entities. As with other thinkers of this ilk, the old or older woman presents a problem for him. She appears as a panderer, or as one who advises that men bring the whip when he comes to women. As one critic puts it, he is decidedly critical of older women and feminists who devalue their childbearing abilities and want to see themselves as equal to men. So the woman is either relegated to this role, or if she tries to step out of it, he finds a way of pathologizing that desire. Again, not unusual in his time. Not so much his time, but not so unusual in this line of thinking. As much as Nietzsche finds the image of Dionysus sexually freeing, he's still taking his models of sexual unions and heterosexuality from what are basically pre-Socratic ideas. In his book, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, makes reference to a view of the world which is divided in sexual terms into passive and active. Okay? So women are seen as passive, males are seen as active. Women are acted upon, men act in the world. For lovers, this is a quotation, for lovers in complete and strong sense of the word, sexual gratification is not essential and is really no more than a symbol. For one party, as already said, a symbol of unconditional submission, that is the female. For the other, the symbol of assent to this, a sign of taking possession, the male. The females receive, the males give. It is the same here as with the differences between the sex. one ought not to demand of the artist who gives that he should become a woman that he should receive. And this is continued into discussions of male homosexuality. You can't, honestly look at ancient Greek culture without discussing male homosexuality, where the male who receives is the lower of the two men and is seen as subject to the other, sometimes as being younger than the other of necessity, and that he will eventually become a dominant one. So to see him using this language of submission in dealing with mature women isn't shocking, right, given what he's reading. Nietzsche, who smashed so many philosophical and conceptual dichotomies, seemingly accepted these essentializing notions. He promises a Dionysian sexuality, a new coupling that should, to follow the method of his other works, not only give us something new, but also to deny the reality of the pre-existing dichotomies. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Everybody get what I'm saying here? Active, passive, right? Those are the two dichotomies that we have, right? And usually when Nietzsche sees those dichotomies, he says, we're not going to accept the fact that we have this duality and we have to make a choice. We are going to say these are not the only choices and rethink the situation. But in a lot of his writings about sexuality, it's disturbingly conventional. So the true and apparent worlds disappear together in Nietzsche's philosophy. Objectivity and subjectivity disappear together, right? Those dichotomies. Good and evil disappear together. They are equally limited in their ability to shed light upon the world that we live in. With these dismantled dichotomies, he usually engages in a tripartite analysis, 3 parts, right? He shows how these were only constructs, shows next that what they were able to do when they functioned helpfully in a culture at a certain time, and finally shows how they are now retrogressive in contemporary philosophical thought. We don't need them. It's time to move on. Okay? That's the 3 stages of analysis he usually goes through with that kind of thinking. Yet in Nietzsche's writings about sex, we are teased by his metaphorical promises, but it is unclear that he delivers on the suggestions for a new sexuality. It's hard to think of a new heterosexual sexuality without rethinking gender altogether. His views on sexuality are hyper-masculinized, though. And this is a quotation, sexual love, too, belongs here. It desires to overpower, to take possession. It appears as self-surrender. Fundamentally, it is only love of one's instrument, of one's steed. Now I need a banana. You gotta come back to it. The conviction that this or that belongs to one because one is in a position to use it. Okay, and such metaphors abound in his work. That's not the only one. This is from The Will to Power, so it is from unpublished writings toward his final book. Since his view is so profoundly masculine, his fear is predictable: emasculation and castration. Right? The following is just an extension of the criticism of Christianity mentioned above, but it is nevertheless important. So it extends the critique and fear into all contemporary morality. Affect, great desire, the passion for power, love, revenge, possessions. Moralists want to extinguish and uproot them, to purify the soul of them. The founder of Christianity recommended this practice to his disciples. The case of sexual excitation. The consequence is, unfortunately, not only the loss of an organ, but the emasculation of man's character. So in early Christianity, there were literally people who are chopped off, right? But there is also what he calls this metaphorical emasculation. And the same applies to the moralist madness that demands, instead of restraining the passions, their extirpation. In conclusion, its conclusion is always, only the castrated man is good. Nietzsche's point is a powerful one, but in his writings, the woman is often left castrated, her passions extirpated. In a sense, Nietzsche is dealing with the great conundrum of the European man's heterosexuality. Indeed, at times he alludes to the social superiority of the homosexual and homosocial cultures of ancient Greece. Part of the riddle of Socrates can be explained by his erotic nature. All great achievements on the part of the man of antiquity were supported by the fact that that man stood beside men, and that a woman was not allowed to claim to be the nearest or highest, let alone the sole object of his love. Okay, again, a reference to this homosocial aspect of Greek antiquity. If we take this passage with the latter one, we see a profound consequence of this earlier remark, that the degree and kind of a man's sexuality reach up into the pinnacle, ultimate pinnacle of his spirit. The expressive, dignified, masculinist culture of antiquity is thus tamed. Compared with these virile images from antiquity, Christian culture offers the pale perversion of desire. The Christian sex impulse, or as he puts it, kind of limply, marriage. Right? So if you this is kind of an ending of this idea of power or overpowering in a sanctified union that meets the criteria of the active and passive person. The suppression of masculine sexual desire, taming it, moralizing it, all of these harm not only men but also the whole culture. I'm trying to see if I can skip something. Although his early remarks on women are extremely conventional and stereotyped, for example, he says in Daybreak, "For in the Orient, women regard chastisement and the secret seclusion of the person from the world as a sign of their husband's love, and complain if this sign is lacking. Women want passivity, and women's sexual passion must still be held in check, lest ignorant young wives may become accustomed to the frequent enjoyment of sex, and miss it greatly if their husband becomes ill or prematurely feeble. It is precisely this innocent and credulous idea that frequent intercourse is thoroughly right and proper that it produces in them a need which later exposes them to violent temptations or worse." We need to translate that. Okay, if a young woman in heterosexual relationships becomes used to having regular sexuality and is encouraged to enjoy it, if then the husband can't perform, she may be tempted to go elsewhere to seek her satisfaction. Okay? So that the idea that, in a way, withholding sexuality from the female to whom one is married to is actually setting you up for a good lifelong activity. Some people have slightly different views of this. On a few occasions, Nietzsche does try to figure out what love and sex could be to a woman, and he states one conundrum with some perspicacity. This is a section called On Female Chastity. It's in the book called The Gay Science. There is something quite amazing and monstrous about the education of upper-class women. All the world is agreed that they are to be brought up as ignorant as possible of erotic matters, that one has to imbue their souls with a profound sense of shame in such matters, right? Oh, sex. Then to be hurled, what happens in their life, as by some gruesome lightning bolt, into reality and knowledge by marriage. So here's this young woman, right? She's an upper class woman, she's educated, she's privileged, entirely ignorant of sexuality. And then, what is her career going to be? Her career is going to be marriage. Ba-boom, into marriage. So, I hope I didn't lose my place here. Right, and she's this marriage precisely by the man they love and esteem both. This is a psychic knot that has been tied and that may have no equal. Even the compassionate curiosity of the widest student of humanity is inadequate for guessing how this or that woman manages to accommodate herself to this solution of the riddle, and to the riddle of a solution, and what dreadful far-reaching suspicions must stir in her poor unhinged soul, and how the ultimate philosophy and skepsis of women casts anchor at this point. But my point is, in fairness to Nietzsche, at least he sees it, right? He sees the problem of, in some way, and for our own generation, right, women have to, if have to be decent, they have to not be sluts, right, blah, 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 blah. And then, if they win the great prize of marriage, they're seen primarily in terms of their sexuality, that is in their ability to have sex and their ability to reproduce. So how can you make a person who's incredibly naive and ignorant about this, and then bam them in, smash, they're into a world in which this is all present. And he says, of course, it would make a person crazy, right? So in spite of his conventionalism, he shows some sensitivity to the plight of the female in the demand for her sexual ignorance and the assumption that she is entirely sexual, that is biologically sexual. The enormous expectation in sexual love and the sense of shame in this expectation spoils all perspective for women from the start, he says in his book, Beyond Good and Evil. So again, there's no single work by Nietzsche on sexuality. His views have to be pieced together from these remarks in other areas, and he writes in aphorisms, so it's fairly easy to do. There's no doubt that he took sexuality as crucial to his idea of who the new man could be, who the new person. The degree and kind of men's sexuality reached up to the ultimate pinnacle of his spirit. As one of the primary interpreters of the mixed and multiple motivations that lie behind human action, it is not surprising to see passion, sensuality, and sexuality emerging in almost every analysis and speculation in his and speculations on his sexual life are so common, important, and commonly found everywhere in scholarly works. Such writings about his own sexual lives do exist, are often highly suspect. I'm just going to ignore that because they are highly suspect, if anybody wants to ask. Okay, I did it. So I hope I didn't succeed in that very difficult thing of making sex boring. But I hope that I kept you interested. So can we have some questions? Yes.
It's really interesting. I love the fact that he was so enamored with Salome. Like I think it's such an interesting. It's interesting to think about how he thinks of women, given that he was in love with a woman that didn't ask for freedom. She took it. She was very much somebody that was strong and interesting in that way. So it's interesting to me. Maybe she burned him so bad.
It's possible. Nietzsche met lots of this whole new generation of educated women who were, for the very first time, being able to go not just to university but to higher education to get master's degrees and PhDs. And he met them a lot through this woman, Malvida von Meisenbuch, who was a proponent of education, for higher education for women. So she was like a magnet for other intellectuals too. His friend Paul Ray, he met through her too. So he met Lou Andrea Salome when her mom brought her from Russia, and to do kind of the grand tour, the intellectual tour. Actually, mom didn't have a chaperone of her. But she talked her mother into leaving her in the care of Malvida, and Malvida introduced her to both Paul Ray and Nietzsche. And for a while they had this little triangular relationship. Unclear precisely how it went sexually, but we do know that Nietzsche, I was just reading something, well, Nietzsche went for a 10-hour walk with her one day. So I'm not sure. Did walk a lot, as I said in the most, but if I had been walking right now. And she lived with Paul, and after she said no to a proposal from Nietzsche, she did go and live with Paul Ray for a while, before then going on to have a relationship with Rilke for a while, and eventually she became a psychoanalyst, working with Sigmund Freud. So quite a very interesting woman to be studied in her own right. I'm not sure if that answers you.
I'm wondering if you've ever encountered sort of sexism within the field of Nietzsche study today and in philosophy generally, and if so, do you have any philosophical advice for how to combat that or how to deal with that?
Yes. Yes, I have encountered that. I've encountered the idea that women are constitutionally incapable of doing it. I taught before I taught here, I taught at an institution. We brought back a former, someone who had gotten their undergraduate degree from that institution, and the provost was there who had been a philosophy professor, and she said when she was ready to go on for her PhD in philosophy, this particular guy was a professor at the time, said to her, "You don't have to go on for a degree in philosophy. You're good looking. You can get a husband." You know, so I think there still is the presumption. Now, I don't look like a philosopher, right? Where's my beard? Where's, you know, I'm working on it, but I haven't really got there yet. So, you know, so we still have kind of ideas. I was thinking the other thing, which I really want to benefit from, which is the idea of the absent-minded professor. Right? Can I be an absent-minded professor, or am I just going to be considered incompetent? Right? It's like, in other words, there are lots of things that we associate with a masculinity that is engaged intellectually, but that we don't really allow when it comes from a female figure. So many examples, I find it really painful to see it perpetuated generation after generation. And I particularly, because of my social, political, educational commitments, think it's so bad to perpetuate this, because if we don't have alliances, we are not going to have change. So if we don't respect each other across gender, race, class, and other kinds of things, and we don't do the hard work of finding out where that other person lives, we're going to successfully not bring about change. So yes, I think it's perpetuated. It's perpetuated in writings, even in Nietzsche studies, I guess would be a natural place to find it. Yes, in Nietzsche studies too. There are, however, not only current people who work on Nietzsche and find him, as I do, sort of provocative and interesting, and answer more about that. But there were, even while he was alive, just in the period, unfortunately, where he was ill in the latter part of his life, he was very influential on a number of feminist groups, and ironically, given the type what this paper is about, and I've written another paper on this subject, but he was on feminist groups. Feminists love him, and especially the feminists who loved him in the period, the late 19th century, up to the First World War, were often the most radical, pro-sex, free love kind of feminists, right? Not, I guess, but they thought Nietzsche, in his ideas of forming a self, transforming yourself, becoming what you can be, women were like, yeah, that would be good. If I lived in such a world that I could transform myself to have that kind of potential. Wow, what a world that I could make. So it's not until the 60s or 70s that this happens. It happens immediately in the latter part of the 19th century, but particularly in that period up till World War I. Yes?
What do you believe, seeing as how Nietzsche was so adept at smashing dichotomies, what do you believe held his sort of rigidity in the dichotomy of male-female gender roles?
I don't know. I think, that it's the hardest of these things to break are when you're getting a benefit from it, right? He gets a benefit from his living with his mother, his aunts, his sister keeping house for him, Lou. He wants Lou Andreas Salome to keep house for him, to be a kind of secretary to him a little bit. She made a very wise decision not marrying that guy. And, he has, at the same time, again, these contradictory ideas. He wants her because she is a companion to his soul. On the other hand, he has this desire for the convention. So I think it is hard, always with people of privilege, to really give up a privilege. And therefore, it's very easy for it to remain invisible to them, right? Yes.
You said in the beginning that he was apolitical or anti-political.
Mm-hmm.
You also said that he was opposed to the state, but also opposed to anarchism.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on why he was anti-statist, but also opposed to anarchism. Because he just fundamentally thought people were stupid and they couldn't organize themselves.
Yeah, a little bit. Yes and no. Okay. This is complicated, and there's a wonderful book by this man named Thomas that my Nietzsche class are reading a couple of articles. One is Nietzsche's relation to feminism, and one is Nietzsche's relation to anarchism. And one of his critiques of anarchism has to be seen in historical context. Anarchism at the end of the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century is a political movement, right? So it's a particular version of anarchism. You know, in a way, if you look at Nietzsche, you say he's very anarchistic because he doesn't want, you know, this power from above, or being honest. Any kind of state, even these repressive educational institutions, he's not liking them at all, right? So it does seem that in a way, isn't he talking about a version of anarchism? I think probably, you know, some kind of anarchy would be something that was more attractive to him. But I love to read the 1911 version of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and if you read how anarchism is defined there, you'll see really what he's talking about specifically, and it is a movement. On the other hand, who's a great fan of Nietzsche, a well-known anarchist? Who wants to dance in the revolution? Emma Goldman, right? Great fan of Nietzsche, anarchist, social, you know, so again. But I think, you know, he doesn't really have an interest in politics. He doesn't see politics as the solution. Part of this is an elitist and bad thing, right? He thinks that these great souls will transform the culture. But part of it is, I think, a good thing, that his sense of power and the way power will emerge is much more diverse, right? And there's no accident that Foucault borrowed his genealogical method from Nietzsche. This is what Foucault saw in Nietzsche. This analysis of sites of power and the idea of the genealogy. Foucault has an essay called Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, if you'd like to explore that. Anyone else have yes?
Going back to your point about, you know, Nietzsche, when he gets to gender dichotomy, he can't like interrogate that dualism the same way he interrogates other dualism. I was wondering, in what sense could you read that problem back into Nietzsche, in the sense that ideas of the active versus the reactive, activity and passivity aren't just more to gender in Nietzsche, they're also part of his thinking about power, the idea of being active better than being reactive, the ressentiment and all that sort of stuff. I mean, how much is a sort of dualism of activity and passivity kind of not just there in Nietzsche's thought of gender, but as at the core of Nietzsche's thought as the one dichotomy he won't give up throughout his thought?
Well, you know, you never want to make Nietzsche Hegel. I mean, he's quite explicit about the birth of tragedy, for example. When he looks back at it, he said, oh my God, I'm looking at the Dionysian impulse in ancient Greece, I'm looking at the Apollonian impulse in ancient Greece, and then I look at the great moment where they come together, I said, oh, Hegel must have been way too much in the back of my mind. So it's not so much that but when he rejects that, he rejects the formulaic element of it. I don't think he sees this world as full of, as giving us either ors, and he thinks we need to look with more subtlety about how things act. So I'm not sure that I would see him I would see those writings really as dichotomous. I do see, when I read the genealogy of morals, I see those changing as he sees as happening over time in almost a Hegelian way. That is, there are moments where the aristocracy rules, and there are moments where this great supposed change comes, but we look under the surface and we see that change is not so great. So I'm not sure I have a simple answer to that, except I think that I guess I believe that when he rejects these dichotomies, he rejects the kind of thinking that forced us into that bifurcation. Now, it doesn't really help us a lot if he comes out with 5 different ideas instead of two, right? But I think, my reading of him is he's trying to give us a more subtle, nuanced analysis of the power situation that's at play, how it occurs in linguistic forms, how it occurs, it doesn't just occur in political forms, and so that we have to look deeper. And that's why I say, in terms of education, what he's saying is, we are not here to accumulate knowledge. We are here to change ourselves and to actively engage in change in the world. So I'm not sure how satisfying that is, but I can check with the Yes?
I guess I'm wondering to what extent you can kind of separate the gender issue from, like, the Apollonian dynamic is very much like a feminine masculine comparison of things. And obviously the gender issues can be looked at with, like, Darwin came a couple years before, so you have the biological perspective on gender, but then also like the femininity and masculinity can kind of be taken as a secondary. So you could have like a masculine female or a feminine male, that kind of thing. And also looking at his history of writing, he starts out as a very masculine writer and becomes very Dionysian by the end of it. He writes in aphorisms and stuff like that. So even though we might have like an outdated gender, do you look at the way in which he looks at the masculine and feminine issue differently than he looks at the gender issue?
Yeah, there's a lot in what you're asking. I mean, I hope I'm not reading into a little Jungian thing going on there. Is that true or not? No, okay. He continues to use metaphors of masculinity as good and femininity as bad. I find that even more disturbing than actually what he says about men and women sometimes, because I find that really retrogressive too. Apollo and Dionysus, as I said, it's an early book. It is a little, Hegel is lurking in the background, that idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But I think maybe I just need to understand your question a little bit better. I don't find, even though Apollo and Dionysus can be read as Apollo masculine, Dionysus feminine, Dionysus is a powerful, overwhelming experience of unity that we find in intoxication and so forth. So it's not directly analogous to masculine and feminine. Is that helpful? Or
Well, I guess I was curious. I didn't realize that he said so much about feminine being like a bad thing and masculine being positive.
Right,
but
yeah.
I know that a lot of times gender is taken separately from like a feminine or masculine perspective in a way. And while a lot of his critiques might be considered gender specific or biological, it's possible to look at the issue not biologically but more perspectival.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, this is work that I'm beginning, and actually, as I've begun it, I hesitated too long, and now some other people have been working on it too. Babette Babbage is quite an interesting scholar at Fordham, has worked recently on the erotic in Nietzsche, and touches on some of these issues. So I would just say, these are things I'm continuing to think about, and I really appreciate your remarks. Help me to think. Yes, please.
How much do you think he was polemicizing against the image of femininity that was common at the time? And how much do you think it was kind of our lurking resentment that he couldn't really unearth in himself?
Well, again, one would hope that what was popular in his time, so many things that were popular in his time, utilitarianism, he actually likes Darwinism more than he likes. He loves to say that we're descended from monkeys. Not to be too arrogant about ourselves and so forth. But let's see. Now I lost my train of thought. So remind me, Chris.
It seems to me like there's a lot of his aphorisms about women that can be taken much more fruitfully if you interpret it as being kind of a polemic against an image of femininity or a common embodiment of femininity in his time that was in fact servile, that was in fact lowly, and it was not embodying the potential of humanity that he saw, not through any fault of the women, but just the fault of the culture and the fault of women's history.
Well, I
But
think,
also
you know,
legitimate resentment that he hasn't been able to work.
You know, I think to a certain extent, we're being hard on him in an area that he didn't choose to primarily engage. You know, who knows what would have happened if he had lived longer or whatever, too. I do say in my work on Nietzsche's relation to actual women that he was very respectful. People, the women who he knew and worked with, Helen Zimmer, who's British, translated his early work, and he had correspondence with her with that upcoming translation in mind. She said she never found him disrespectful. The woman who left him Silverblick, what became the first Nietzsche archive, likewise, so if you read their writings or if you read their letters, he's very respectful of this new generation of women, and a lot of them, of course, are quite interested in his writing. They really find it potentially liberating. So you find this this dichotomy between these things he's saying. Sometimes I agree with him. He says a well-dressed woman is never cold. And he says, what? I'm assuming that she's barely dressed, that she's not wearing a lot, right? But she's not cold because she feels so good about the way she looks. The fact that her, back is entirely exposed in the middle of the winter doesn't matter. Some of them are just, anecdotal, amusing things that I don't necessarily find false. Right? They're just so in some ways he is, speaking about social conventions. And he uses a lot of humor and lightness in the way he speaks as well. No, you've got China, yes.
I found your earlier remarks about Nietzsche's views on education interesting, in part because of the event we had a few weeks ago. But one thing I wrote down here was 2 models of education: produce good workers. And then the second model, education is self-transformation, the magisterial tradition. Nietzsche, of course, supports the second model, as I imagine, as do most of us here today. But why can't you have the second model in democracy too? Which,
No,
if I understood you, Nietzsche seems to think couldn't be.
Oh, Nietzsche actually has a very practical answer to that. He said, how would we get up to speed really having educators to educate everyone to that level? He says, it's of necessity going to be diluted. What I would say to Nietzsche, well, then let's wait a while until we do have, enough educators that can educate up to that, up to that degree. So that's
you don't
part
agree
of
with
it.
him on this point?
I think, I think I very much hope that we can, in institutions that are less expensive, like this institution, provide the kind of quality of education and the challenge that is offered at Bowdoin or Bates or whatever, that we should respect our students enough to challenge and expect of them this very difficult thing, which is to I'm going to use a bad word, metaphor, master text, but to engage with texts in ways that we engage with other respectful interlocutors, and to listen to those texts and to have the confidence in ourselves that we are worth having a conversation with Plato or Simone de Beauvoir or whomever, right? That is the way we should feel about ourselves and about education. And so the dichotomy that Nietzsche finds in culture is a dichotomy between this move toward a very practical, positivistic idea of education, where you learn the language by learning grammar, right? It's like what we're doing now. You learn things to pass a test, right? And then you have accumulated, right, knowledge. And this other thing that says, how do I make this knowledge real? How do I make this knowledge mine? How do I use it to make myself powerful in the world, right? That magisterial tradition. So it's not just the dichotomy that you put is a little more has to do with an earlier writing that he did, the future of educational institution is concerned they'll be watered down to produce basically people who are working businesses and will obey the state and obey the commercial interests of the culture. So that, but that move toward positivism in education has to a large extent won in the sense that the sciences are now seem to be valued above the humanities, and that even things that weren't called sciences, like political science, try to elevate their status by calling themselves political science now, right? The science becomes, art history even had a very positivist moment where it said that art shouldn't be looked at in terms of interpretation or values. We should just find the provenance of the painting, find the date that it was made, and describe how it came into be, and we should x-ray it if we want to know what was going on in it, okay? But again, what does that mean? It means the humanities are being valued in terms of science, so the humanities change and switch in such a way that they try to justify themselves as positive sciences, okay? So my early remarks are trying to say, look, at Nietzsche himself had this kind of education, even though it was narrow, it was deep. And it allowed him to become the person that he was, to engage very broadly with the culture. Can we liberate you a little bit?
Well, I think what I think is really profound about the way in which there's this like technological setting upon education at this point is the fact that like I feel like imagination and wonder are lost in that, and I think that's the most important part of what I find to be so important about philosophy, at least. Like it just opens your mind up to something immense that you can't even fathom, you had in you. So like I think that's the most disturbing part about the technology.
Yeah. Imagination and wonder, and we need space for that, right? It's not something that you can, because these are things that bring about creativity. And creativity, creativity is what fuels our world and the next possibility with our world, right? And I used to feel that about teaching philosophy, that you needed what I called think time from semester to semester, right? You need it, from week to week, for things to just sink in. Doesn't matter, you read it a zillion times or you could read it 3 times. You just need to have it kind of back there for a while. Now, I'm encouraged to teach a course in 7 weeks, right, online. Now, what happens is people who are very, very well prepared get at the gate, run through that course, and they do very well, and they have learned something, right? But these very things that allow us, that allow me to know you, right? That allow us the time to be able to communicate, really. Gone. Very sad, really.
I am relatively new to studying philosophy. The class I'm in with you now is only my 2nd class. And I was sitting here and I was thinking, why is it important, to listen to someone who had such really kind of, like you were saying, elitist, misogynistic. I'm finding him like
More on the negative side.
way up that side,
Well, I think,
Why?
Why? Yeah. There's 2 answers to that question. One is if you don't read misogynist and elitist, you're not going to read, basically intellectual history is over for you. Oh yeah. Until you get to John Stuart Mill. And the other reason, but I think it's a more profound, I think the more profound reason. Now, I'm going to be amazingly honest here, like dangerously honest, that frankly, when women came to their own and were actually allowed in this country into the profession, and the gatekeeping was done in different ways than it was done elsewhere, in order for you to put your own views forward, you had to put them in relation to some philosopher of the past, and that was of necessity a male. Right, because even Simone de Beauvoir was not considered enough of a philosopher to do that. This is, back in my day, I'm saying. So you have these incredibly nuanced and interesting readings of people like Hegel, of people like Marx, of people like Nietzsche. But the people who were chosen because they thought somehow they could get a reading, that there was something there to help in the current transformative process. So it is partially just the nature of institutions is that they are conservative. I'm not going to get my papers published unless I engage with someone, or it's not going to be considered philosophy if I engage with the wrong person, and therefore my work will be dismissed, I will not be promoted, blah, 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 right? And so, especially the very early women entering in this field, for one thing, they were at the same time inventing the field, that is, refining the woman who came up with the idea of the monad, not Leibniz, by the way, right? So they're engaged in a historical analysis of finding a more complex story, and they were also needing legitimacy to go forward. And I think we're really, I'm not even sure if we're done with that job. I hope, I would like to think that we can work in ways that we no longer need to legitimate our work with masculinist views. But I honestly found, like many people, that have found Nietzsche, I honestly found him really liberating in terms of his critiques of rationality, in terms of his critiques of some modes of Christianity, his critique of the otherworldliness of many religions. So it wasn't a dishonest use. I really loved him, and also, unlike so many other philosophers, he wrote beautifully with a big vocabulary, made up new words when he needed to. In German, it's don't let anybody tell you German is an ugly language. When it's in the hands of beautiful writers, it's a beautiful language. So those are three different parts of this. Yeah. If you throw out all the misogynists and racists, what a big doo-doo, that might be good.
Well, like, who is a female philosopher who you respect, a contemporary female?
Linda Alcoff, I respect a lot. She's from a Latina background. She was just president of the American Philosophical Association. She's written on a lot of things. She's written on privilege of white people, of what's a white person to do or something. And I think she's a very subtle and smart thinker. And I could, other time try to give you some more examples of people. She's one of the people I respect the most. Certainly not the best known. People would think more quickly of maybe someone like Judith Butler or someone more widely known. But I really respect her work because of its intersection of race, gender, and class issues. She's very sensitive to all those issues. Maria Lejones, originally from Argentina, is another person I respect. Yes.
You spoke really quickly about Nietzsche being critical of people representing themselves by things other than themselves, in a way. Representing themselves as things outside of themselves. Be it through subscribing to a Christianity, moral fanaticism, and things that he writes about in Daybreak, for instance. And I'm wondering what you would think he would think about what I've seen around as like Facebook fanaticism of curtailing yourself through something obviously outside of yourself.
Well, yeah, Facebook is is complex. It can it's a technology that can be used in a variety of ways. There's ways in which one kind of markets oneself and shows certain aspects of oneself. I guess one thing I like about Nietzsche is that he reveals some things that aren't very attractive right up there about who he is. So I think there's an aspect of managing your image, even if you're not worried that, say, schools are going to look at it or potential employers are going to look at it. But it is, it's limiting. He's critical of the whole movement toward technology over the the more complex modes of understandings that are part of the humanities. So that aspect of itself, the very technology of it, is going to immediately make elements of it discrete. I find myself trying to do that, just trying to put an image with some text sometimes in a particular kind of way. It's not going to let you do it because it's not, it's not set up for us to present the complexity of our humanity. So I think with a lot of technologies, I can't see him. He's critical, as I've mentioned before to those of you in the class. He's critical in his time of journalism because he's saying the prose is going down to the lowest possible denominator because he had no idea that what Facebook would say on little kitten pictures, right? Cute, I'm so cute. Whatever. It's not even English words. I can't think of one offhand. Go what?
I can has cheeseburger.
Yeah, I can has a cheeseburger, right? Or AJC or something, right? Good, thank you. And as you know, I'm not opposed to putting kitties up. My kitties are up all the time. So I think that the idea of lowering the kind of discourse, but also, a lot of philosophers, not just Nietzsche, are concerned when we have only books in front of us and not people, right? Plato talks about this, that, if you just have the book, you don't get you're not going to get the feedback, right? We're complex, embodied beings, right? And, what happens on Facebook, is it's a tool with radical limitations. So to use it for a tiny purpose, so don't you know what that purpose is? If you see just a tiny bit of value to it, I mean, right now I think we're getting to the point where it's potentially dangerous because it's keeping track of way too much information about us, and not just about consumption, but about political things. I mean, it's just like when Netflix started really putting movies that I was interested in. I was like, whoops. Thought it was a little more subtle than that, but apparently, they finally got an algorithm that even got me, right? And I think of myself as fairly eccentric in the movies that I watch. Not to mention my little daughter was sometimes watching with me, but they got it. So, so that's a different story. Maybe the dangerousness of those social media that are being used for basically corporate ends. Does that speak in a deep enough way to what you were saying?
Yeah, I definitely acknowledge that not everyone has a relationship with Facebook in the way that I'm thinking of it.
Uh-huh.
But I did have a Facebook for a little while. I'm thinking about more along the line. It's not so much corporate kind of play with it and exposing you to different things like of that age, but more the impersonal kind of aspects of it, as well as all I can think of as opposed to someone sending you a friend request and then when you actually see them in person, they don't even want to look at you in a way.
Well, yeah, there is this funny aspect of that, isn't there, where you actually learn a lot more about a person sometime than you maybe even necessarily want to know. And then when you see them, you have had a pseudo relationship, and you're like, yeah, somebody hugged me the other night, for example, at a talk on Friday, and I was like, shit, who is this? And it was a Facebook friend of mine who I hadn't seen her in quite a while, so she looked a little different, and I was like, okay. Yeah, so there is that pretendness about the relationship. So you have to, I think that in any of these social media situations, you have to weigh, what has it gained for you, what has it gained. I don't take it as very seriously as a mode of connection. On the other hand, my Iranian friend from 1979 who had to find, he went into exile somewhere, he found me because of it, right? So I do think, there are things, just about when I'm about to, kind of get rid of it or not do it, something like that then allows a more profound connection for me with someone. So, that's me, not Nietzsche. I'm not sure how helpful it is. Okay, well, thank you very very much for coming